Good morning, everyone. This morning, we're going to look at Acts chapter 17. It's good to have everybody here this morning. Good to see our visitors. We have been looking at Paul's missionary journeys. We're making our way through the book of Acts. And we have come to a point to where there's going to be a few bumps in the road, as they say. And one of those bumps this morning, I'm just going to jump right into it, is politics. We're jumping right in the deep end, right to start with. Because politics is religious. I don't mean to say religion is politics. That's not what I'm saying. But I want you to hear me very clearly that politics is religious. That's not a very popular claim today, right? We like to think of separation between church and state and separate our lives into the three things that we don't talk about ever in polite company, right? Religions, politics, and sex. We don't talk about those things. Well, I come here to talk about two of those things this morning, and maybe next time we'll hit the third one. Because there are some outrageous claims being made here in Acts chapter 17. And the first one is, I'm just going to insert some names here, so don't think I'm picking on you. Jessel. Jessel is turning the world upside down. Verna, she's not here this morning. Verna, she's had these rebels in her house. Right? Clint and Liv, they're not here this morning either. They're traveling. Clint and Liv are acting against the decrees of our president. Oh, I meant to say Caesar. Sorry. Right? They're saying there's another king, this Jesus. And so I want to ask you a question this morning that has been very popular. It was popularized actually by the preacher at Jimmy Carter's church. And the question is, how many of us could be convicted of being Christian based on our daily statements? How many of us could be convicted in a court of law of being Christian based on our daily statements? How many of us, to get back to Acts chapter 17, what Neo read, right? How many of us could it be said that the crowd and the authorities were greatly agitated at us? Right? What would we do if we were like Paul and we were being hit on two sides at once? On the one hand, we have threats and oppositions from the people we most closely identify with, the Jews. On the other hand, like in Philippi last week, so Philippi is up there in the top left, the very top left. He's now moving on to Thessalonica, which is 10 miles away or so. What would we do if, like in Philippi, we have pagans who are whipping up charges about politics, about laws, about customs, about religious questions, especially questions that protect their economic and political power? What happens when those two waves, the people we most closely identify with and the pagan majority, when they're both coming after us? What happens? Well, what happens is a riot. That's the answer. Right? And we're going to be getting used to that by now, because that's what happened in Philippi. It's what happens here in Thessalonica, and it's going to happen more times coming up in our studies here in Acts. And so this morning, I want to take a look at the first half of Acts chapter 17. This is a little bit more zoomed in view, hopefully that you can see here. And I want you to compare your own actions with the actions of Paul and Silas and Timothy and probably Luke, who was there with them. And I want of Christianity. Not to say that it's all bad, but it's definitely not based in the Bible. Paul is not just saying, here, try this new philosophy on and see if it fits you. If it doesn't, that's okay too. The problem here is that these new converts are challenging the status quo of the community. These new converts are not going down to the silversmith and buying new little silver idols. They're not going down to the woodcarver and buying wooden idols. They're not bringing their offering to the temple, to the pagan temples. And believe it or not, this is not illegal, because you weren't required by law necessarily to worship these gods. Depends on how you read the law, but it was not illegal. But you know what it is it is subversive. The Roman cultural order was built on very clear hierarchies of power, right? There was the emperor, and what was his title after the empire period, after the republic? Caesar. Augustus especially. Augustus was like, you are God now. And so we have demigod up here, almost God, or maybe you're made God after you die. And then underneath him, you have the Senate, right? And those are made up of wealthy people. There's a couple different classes there. But so we have Caesar, we have the demigod, then we have the Senate. It's made up of patricians, wealthy landowners. So far, we've talked about three different classes here of people. Wealthy landowners being the biggest. That made up 0.3% of the Roman Empire. Not even 0.5% is what we're talking about here of the population. And everyone else was either plebeians, which is like you're a citizen but you don't own anything, which is what Paul was, freedmen, and slaves. We're talking about 70% of the population was in some form of servitude or slavery. Can you imagine when you come along and organize that 70% of the population to say, I don't buy into your system anymore? There's going to be some political problems come out of that, right? And so Paul preaches the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ in the synagogue, it says, for 3 Sabbaths. How long is that? About a month, give or take. At least 3 Saturdays, right? And Paul says, or Luke says that Paul was interpreting, and he was explaining why it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise again from the dead. This is verse 3. This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. Or I was noticing that my CSB here says Messiah. It goes ahead and translates that word. Because remember, Christ is not his last name. Christ is the translation from the Hebrew for Messiah, or chosen one. Or there's a couple different words it translates. But Paul was explaining and interpreting why it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise again from the dead, right? And he's doing it in a synagogue. Remember, this is a group of Jews. These are people who are not unlearned in the scriptures. These are people who knew the scriptures. And so a crucified Messiah, a crucified Savior, is the major roadblock in the way of any devout Jew believing that Jesus was the one who could be God's anointed. Of course, the word anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. Sounds familiar? Just like Messiah. It's transliterated from it. And so how could God allow such a thing? How could God be honored by his own son coming and dying? By the Messiah coming and dying? How could God, through that kind of defeated Messiah, how could he do the messianic work of bringing peace and justice to the world? How could a defeated Messiah rebuild the temple? We're looking for a strong man, is what they're looking for. Someone who could organize things, get things together, push out the Roman influence, bring things back to the old days, the way it used to be, right? Back in the 1950s. Oh, I'm in, 250s BC, right? We don't have a list. It doesn't tell us what passages that Paul used. But I think actually we can be pretty accurate in guessing that because Paul later quotes these verses that I'm about to mention here in his letters to these same churches that he's just visited, I would say these are some of the verses that he used to prove that this Messiah needed to suffer and rise again from the dead. And of course, the big one, Isaiah 53. But also, I think Genesis chapter 22. Paul uses Genesis chapter 22 in one of his letters. I forgot to write which one it was. When he's Romans 8. Paul uses Genesis chapter 22 and Abraham's almost sacrifice of Isaac as an example. Psalm 22, right? Which is read as a prayer of the Messiah. And maybe even Zechariah's. A lot of people overlook Zechariah. I don't study Zechariah enough anyway. Zechariah's, his prophecy, his oracles, whatever you want to call them, of suffering and vindication from that suffering, that God was going to bring them out of and not just out of it, but through that suffering to be vindicated. At its very core, though, when we talk about the Bible, it's presenting us a very simple, but also a very profound explanation. And that is that Jesus chose to die because he loves humanity. And of course, that obviously is going to require some unpacking that we don't have time to get to all today, but the Bible's backstory, when we look at the overview of the backstory of the Bible, it really is going to shed some light. It's going to tell us what's going on here with Jesus. Because this is sort of a complex idea, and it's the reason I like the term Hebrew meditation literature. Because when you read it one time, you kind of get the basic idea. But then you read it again, and you're like, oh yeah, there's that aspect to it too. And then you read it again, and you think about it, and oh, that connects back over to here, this one. And so this Hebrew meditation literature is designed to bring out all the different facets of this explanation that Jesus chose to die because he loves humanity. Because the story going back, the story of Israel, God's people, going into this dark tunnel of slavery, right? Why did they go to Egypt originally? They were starving. Well, why did they go to Egypt before that, though? Because they sold their brother into slavery, right? And then what happens to them? They eventually get into slavery. And so there's a repetition of the pattern there. And so the story of Israel is going into this dark tunnel in slavery in Egypt, only to be rescued during Passover. It's the story of Israel in Jerusalem being destroyed and the nation being carried away to Babylon, only to be brought back and rebuilt after a time period of slavery and tribulation that they thought would be very final. In other words, what we're talking about here is a story whose main themes are about suffering and vindication, disaster and reversal, death and resurrection. This is the story of Israel. And from once you understand that point, it's only a small little step to the conclusion that if that is how the storyline works, and if that's what the messianic prophecies are shaped by, if they're shaped by disaster and reversal, by death and resurrection, then this Jesus, who is crucified and risen, truly is the Messiah. And that's Paul's argument here in the first few verses when he's talking to these Jews. It's the whole storyline of Israel. After he demonstrates that from the scriptures, he shows them, right? This Jesus whom I preach to you, proclaim to you, is the Christ. That's verse 3. I want us also to think, so he could have proven it from the scriptures. Now, it was pretty well known, especially among the Jewish world, that this Jesus had died. And Paul had many different ways of proving that he had risen, actually. And this proof was not just limited to his own testimony of, I saw a light, right? It wasn't just limited to that. That's a powerful testimony. Paul gave visual displays of the living and divine power of Jesus by working miracles in his name. We don't get it in this chapter, but in chapter 19 it's mentioned. And so maybe it seems obvious, to me at least, but to resist the power of a miracle that happens in front of you goes not only against your own common sense, but against the great Creator God who empowers that miracle too. All right. So Paul's method was to fearlessly preach the truth, right? And to leave the consequences to God and to the people he was preaching to. Because Paul was not just offering some new religious experience. He wasn't offering, what's the new popular religious experience in Mexico? Ayahuasca. The frog poison that they lick that puts you on a trip, on a drug-induced trip that is supposedly spiritual. That's not what Paul is offering. He's not offering them a spiritual experience. That's not what he's offering. He's announcing to the world that its creator is coming back, has come back to set everything back right. He is turning the world, you got it wrong here, we're going to turn that upside down. Because what's the first charge there in verse 6? And when they could not find him, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the authorities, shouting, "These men have turned the world upside down, and now they have come here also." And Jason received them. If we can't get Paul, we'll get Jason, right? These are the people who came from Thessalonica, sometimes it's said. They subvert is the word that's used. They overthrow the world. They cause trouble everywhere. They're accused of stirring things up. Same thing that happened last week that we saw in chapter 16 in Acts. It's actually the same phrase there that's used all the way back in Luke chapter 23. What happened in Luke chapter 23? Anybody remember? The end of the book. What happens at the end of Luke? Crucifixion. It's the charge against Jesus. It's the same charge that they're bringing against Jesus, that he overthrows the current order. And so Paul was opposing the idea that Jesus was an earthly king. That's not what he's claiming. But he has not failed to represent Jesus as a king. The people saw that. And so one reason why these Greek and, mostly Roman, but one reason why these Roman rulers were so upset by this accusation was the fact that the Jews had recently been banished from where? Max. Thank you. Where had the Jews just been banished from? Anybody remember their history? Rome, right? Priscilla and Aquila, that we're going to meet in the next couple chapters, they had just been kicked out of Rome because Mr. Nero didn't like the Jews. He liked to blame everything on everybody else. So when the city burned down, who did he blame it on? The Jews, even though it was his own fault. We're going to meet Priscilla and Aquila next week, but the unbelieving Jews here in Thessalonica, where Paul is, they're very eager to show their loyalty to Caesar. Because they've just been kicked out of Rome. Who knows what they might do to him now if they cause more trouble. Right? I want you to back up, though. One of our categories this morning was Greek. It's Greek to me, right? I want us to look at one of the words here because it says in Acts chapter 17, when it talks about Caesar here, I didn't write it down, so it's verse 6, I think. Oh, 7. And they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar. Anybody know what that Greek word there is for decrees of Caesar? It sounds very familiar because it crosses over into English. The word there is dogma. The dogma of Caesar. Now that's a churchy word too that's used in the high church, the Catholics and such, because they have dogmas, they have rules, decrees that are made by certain councils and different things. We don't have those, so we might not have a history with that word, but the fundamental decree or dogma of Caesar, what's the fundamental rule about Caesar? Is that he is Caesar, that he is emperor, like he's in charge. I mean, rabbit trail, again, really quick, historically. Paul is let me just back up so you can see the map. Paul is in northern Greece. It says Achaia right there, but that's Greece. Let me back up one more. Over here on the far left, that's Greece, modern day Greece. Northern Greece, here where it says Macedonia, that had just been the site of a rebellion. If we remember, there was a civil war here, a terrible civil war that had been fought not even 20 years before this, between a few famous people that we might remember their names, Mark Antony and Octavian. Because they were fighting after the person who had killed Julius Caesar, whose name was what? Et tu, Brutus? You too, Brutus? You're going to kill me? Brutus tried to take over. Brutus and Cassius was a general, tried to take over after they killed Julius Caesar. And Mark Antony and Octavian then defeat Brutus and Cassius brutally here. And Octavian finally fights Mark Antony because, there can only be one. This is Highlander territory. There can only be one. And so Octavian finally wins. And the Senate not only declares him Caesar, but they declare him Augustus Caesar. So the phrase, when Paul is being accused of claiming that there is another king, man, that sounds very familiar. Because we just fought a civil war over two people who thought they were king. Right? And less than 20 years later after this, we're going to have what's called the year of 4 emperors, AD 69, where we have 4 more kings who fight it out in this area. And so this accusation that's being brought against Paul is very serious. This is earth-shattering. If what he claims is true, there is another king, this is very important. So this charge was very believable. Let's move on here to Berea real quick, just real quick, because the city here in verse 10. So I kind of left out, just for time's sake, some stuff here. But Paul had to skip town because things were getting hot. And he decides, or maybe the people decide, maybe his brothers and sisters there decide for him that he needs to leave for his own best interests and for theirs. And so he skips town and goes not very far away to Berea, another 15 or 20 miles away. And it says, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away, verse 10, by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. And that sounds familiar. He does that in every stop, by the way. Even if there isn't a synagogue, he will go down to the river wherever the Jews are meeting, having prayer. Now these Jews were more noble than the ones in Thessalonica, and they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women and women of high standing, as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, because remember, they're not too far away from each other, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. And then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. And those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after received a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible after they departed. Okay, we're not going to get into Athens this morning because we're out of time. But I want to say a few closing thoughts here about what's going on here. Whether by land or sea, Paul is now leaving the Macedonian area. And he starts out for a new province in the Roman Empire called Greece. He's planted communities of believers along the way in 3 important cities there in Macedonia. And Thessalonica, the one we've been looking at mostly this morning, has this very central location. And so these cities are radiating outwards from this sort of central location there in Macedonia. But I want us to back up all the way. Remember in Bible class, Neo mentioned Antioch. I want us to back up and think about what's going on there, because this flagship church of this diverse Jesus movement, that flagship church was Antioch. It was the largest city in that part of the Roman Empire. And we meet them in chapter 13, right, where the book of Acts begins this whole new section. In Antioch, the Spirit prompts the church there to send Paul on this missionary journey. Right? And now we see the stories about Paul and his co-workers. They're traveling to different cities around the Roman Empire, announcing the good news that what? What's the good news they're announcing? Neo? What's the good news they're announcing? That Jesus is King. That's the gospel. Right? That's the thing that's mentioned 40 some odd times there in Matthew, right? The first thing that's mentioned after he gets back from his temptation in the wilderness, he goes out and what is he doing? Teaching the gospel of the kingdom. Kingdom needs a king. And so this first mission that Paul goes on is to the interior of what we would call modern day Turkey, right? Asia Minor. And it ends with this important meeting back in Jerusalem with the apostles. The second mission, though, where we're at today, is through Asia Minor and then extending into ancient Greece. There's a third mission that we're going to look at after this that's through the same territory again, and it concludes with Paul's journey all the way back to Jerusalem and his arrest there in Jerusalem. The reason I want to give this overview again is because Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but he's also the risen King of all nations. And membership among his people is not based on ethnic identity. It's not based on following the laws of the Torah. It's based simply on trusting Jesus and following or obeying his teachings. And so there's a new reality that's showing itself. There is a new multi-ethnic reality to Jesus' movement that he's starting. And that leads us to the next theme that Luke wants us to see in these missionary journeys here as a whole, as a big picture. The things that we've looked at today, and that is the clash of cultures between early Christians and the Roman and the Greek world. There's multiple clashes. We looked at one last week in Philippi. We looked at one today in Thessalonica. We're going to see another one next week in Athens. Ephesus, we're going to see it again. Paul goes and he announces Jesus as the revealing, as the revelation of the one true God, and as the king of the world who shows up all these other gods. He shows up all these other idols as powerless, as futile. And that message is continuously, it is consistently subversive to the Roman way of life, to the Roman authorities, political authorities. So much so that he gets charged with being a dangerous social revolutionary. Paul and these Christians are consistently being accused of rebellion against Caesar, the Roman emperor, because the people heard Paul correctly. He was announcing that there was another king, King Jesus, and they correctly saw that the Christian way of life was a challenge to the Roman cultural values, right? So there's a paradox. These stories show us the paradox that the early church presented to the world, that this is a Jewish messianic movement, but it's also ethnically diverse. It's full of communities that treated men and women and rich and poor and slave and free. Remember the 99.7% of the population, those guys? It treated all of those people as equals, unlike the society that was around them. And they all gave their allegiance to King Jesus alone and no other God. And importantly, no other king. And so their very existence turned society upside down. It turned upside down the core values of the Roman culture, of the American culture. But these Christians, they pose no military threat because Jesus taught them to be a people of peace. And so the takeaway for us is, are we willing to challenge the political structure right now to teach what is right about treating others like you want to be treated, of treating others like human beings and not as cattle, not as slaves? Because really the only crime that they could be accused of was not conforming to the status quo. The status quo of the local power brokers, political entities. Like the ones that the King James uses language that we don't use anymore. Occasionally that language comes back into vogue. One of those words, based, is all back in popularity now. And the King James says that the crowd hired certain lewd fellows of the baser sort. Right? We use that word since it's back in popularity now. And so the question I have for you is, what about you? Where do you stand? Have you given your allegiance to the Messiah? Are you ready for him to rule over your life? Are you ready for him to rule over your life so that you can be transformed back into the true image of God? The image from Genesis chapter 1. The image that was broken by sin in the garden. Are you ready to be a part of God's rule? Are you ready to co-rule with God, with him, over the creation, over the new creation? If you are, you need to put your allegiance into Christ. You need to declare your allegiance. You need to pledge your allegiance to Christ. If you need to do that, we can help you with that this morning. Please come find one of us and we can help you. That's the lesson for this morning for Acts chapter 17, the first half of it. Next week, we'll look at the second half when Paul goes to Athens and gives his address there. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see you all next week. Yeah, let's all stand and sing.
358. Let's